The rain hammered the corrugated tin roof of the barn with such violence that Tom Hendricks couldn't hear his own thoughts. He stood in the doorway, watching water pool across the runway he'd carved from his grandfather's soybean field 40 years ago. The bank had given him 30 days. After that, the land, all 200 acres of it, including the airstrip, would belong to someone else. He'd already moved most of his tools into storage, already said goodbye to the Cessna he'd sold to pay last year's property taxes, but he kept the runway lights operational. He didn't know why. Maybe habit, maybe hope, maybe just stubborn pride. At 11:47 that night, the sound cut through the storm like a blade through silk. Tom knew rotors. He'd worked ground crew at Fort Campbell in the 70s, back when helicopters were simpler machines and the world made more sense. This wasn't a news chopper or a medevac. This was military, heavy, twin-engine. He grabbed his rain slicker and ran toward the airstrip, boots sucking mud with every step. The aircraft materialized from the darkness like something summoned. A black hawk, matte black, no markings visible through the sheets of rain. It hovered for a moment, rotors churning the storm into a vortex, then settled onto the asphalt with surprising gentleness. Tom approached cautiously, shielding his eyes from the rotor wash. The side door slid open, and two figures emerged. One was a young man in standard flight gear, moving with the efficient urgency of someone on a tight schedule. The other was a woman, shorter, older, maybe mid-40s, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a flight suit that had seen better days and carried herself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need announcement. When she looked at Tom, her eyes were the color of steel catching light, gray, sharp, measuring. "This airstrip operational," she called over the noise. Tom nodded, still processing the surreal nature of military hardware sitting on his dying farm. "Fuel. Got a tank, 100 gallons of Jete, maybe less." She turned to the young man, said something Tom couldn't hear, then approached the farmer directly. Up close, he could see the weathering on her face, not age but exposure. Sun damage around the eyes, a thin scar along her jawline. The name tape on her chest read Kestrel but no rank insignia. No unit patches. Nothing to indicate who she was or why she dropped from the sky onto his foreclosed runway at midnight in the middle of a June thunderstorm. "Need to ask you something," she said, voice low enough that only he could hear. "And I need an honest answer." The rain kept falling. The rotors kept turning. And Tom Hendricks, who had 30 days left on land his family had worked for generations, looked into the eyes of this strange pilot and nodded once. Whatever was happening here, whatever impossible thing had brought her to this place, he understood instinctively that the answer he gave would matter in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The woman who called herself Kestrel studied him for another long moment, then glanced back at the Black Hawk. Its bulk crouched on his runway like a sleeping predator. "You ever wonder," she said, rain streaming down her face, "why some pieces of ground matter more than others?" Tom thought about his grandfather planting the first soybeans in 1948. Thought about his father teaching him to fly over these same fields in a rusted Piper Cub. Thought about the runway he'd poured himself, section by section, summer after summer, because he believed that a place where aircraft could touch Earth safely was a place worth protecting. He thought about all of this in the space of a single breath, and then he answered. "I expect it's the same reason some pilots keep flying even when the easy thing would be to stay grounded." Something shifted in Kestrel's expression, not quite a smile, but close. She nodded to the young man, who jogged back to the Black Hawk and began unloading equipment. Cases. Heavy, military-grade cases with alphanumeric codes stenciled in yellow. Tom watched them work with the synchronized efficiency of a crew that had done this before, many times, in places probably a lot less hospitable than a Missouri soybean farm. "You're not here by accident," Tom said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Kestrel agreed. She pulled a laminated map from her flight suit, unfolded it partially, showed him a series of marks in red ink. "We're not, and neither are you. This land, your airstrip specifically, sits at a geographic intersection that makes it strategically valuable. You wouldn't know it. The bank doesn't know it. But certain people have been watching this location for 15 years, waiting for circumstances to align. What circumstances? The kind where a good man loses everything and has nothing left to protect except his integrity. She refolded the map, tucked it away. The kind where someone desperate enough to keep runway lights burning in a thunderstorm might be willing to let the right people land, no questions asked, for reasons that won't make sense until later. Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. What are you asking me? Permission, 24 hours of operational security, no contact with anyone outside this property, no calls, no internet, no witnesses. In exchange, when we leave, the foreclosure disappears. The bank suddenly discovers a clerical error. Your land stays yours, free and clear. It sounded impossible. It sounded illegal. It sounded exactly like every conspiracy theory Tom had ever dismissed as paranoid fantasy. But the Black Hawk was real. The woman standing in front of him was real. And the rain kept falling on runway lights that had stayed lit for no logical reason, except that something in Tom's bones had told him to keep them burning. What's the catch? Kestrel smiled then, thin and sharp. The catch is you won't be able to tell anyone. Not your family, not your friends, not the newspaper when they ask why the foreclosure vanished. You'll just be the lucky farmer who caught a break. And you'll wonder sometimes if any of this actually happened. Tom looked past her at the Black Hawk, at the young man now setting up perimeter equipment around the runway. Looked at his barn, his house, the field stretching dark under storm clouds. Everything his grandfather had built. Everything his father had maintained. Everything he'd fought to keep alive. When do you need an answer? Now, Kestrel said simply. The window is small, and there are people already looking. The rain intensified. Lightning flickered somewhere over the eastern fields, illuminating the world in brief, stark clarity before darkness rushed back in. Tom Hendricks had 30 days to save a life's worth of work, or he had right now to make a choice that defied every practical instinct he'd ever developed. He extended his hand. Kestrel shook it once, firm and quick, then turned and made a hand signal toward the helicopter. The operation began in earnest. The young man, who never introduced himself and whose name tape read only Bishop, worked with mechanical precision, establishing what looked like a temporary command post inside Tom's barn. Screens flickered to life, casting blue light across hay bales and rusted farm equipment. Kestrel moved between the Black Hawk and the barn, coordinating via hand signals and encrypted radio bursts that Tom couldn't decipher even when he caught fragments through open doors. Around 2 in the morning, a second aircraft arrived. Smaller, faster, Tom recognized the profile of a little bird, the kind special operations units used for insertion and extraction. It touched down just long enough to drop 2 more personnel, both moving with the same silent efficiency, then vanished back into the storm. The new arrivals wore different gear, heavier armor, weapons slung in practice positions. They acknowledged Kestrel with brief nods, and immediately began establishing defensive positions around the perimeter. Tom brought coffee at 3. Nobody asked for it, but nobody refused either. Kestrel accepted a mug without comment, wrapping both hands around it like she hadn't felt warmth in a long time. She stood near the barn entrance, watching the runway through night vision goggles she'd pulled from somewhere in her vest. You should get some sleep, she told Tom without looking at him. This will be a long 24 hours. Don't think I could. He stood beside her, following her gaze even though he couldn't see what she was seeing through those goggles. You going to tell me what this is about? No. Figured. They stood in silence for a while, listening to rain and distant thunder and the low electronic hum of equipment in the barn behind them. Finally, Kestrel lowered the goggles, let them hang around her neck. In the dim light, Tom could see exhaustion carved into her features, not the kind from lack of sleep, but the deeper kind from carrying weight too long. "You were a pilot," she said, "not a question. Long time ago, nothing like you're flying. Fixed wing. Mostly, some rotary training, but I never had the touch for helicopters." He paused. "You're good, though. The way you brought that Black Hawk down in this weather, that's not standard skill." "No," Kestrel agreed, "it's not." Another silence. Tom sensed there was more, something she was deciding whether to share. He waited, patient in the way farmers learn to be, knowing some things couldn't be rushed. "I flew the first female combat mission in Iraq," Kestrel said finally, voice low. 2003, Apache gunship. We took fire over Nasiriyah, sustained damage that should have brought us down. I kept her flying for 40 minutes on hydraulics that were basically prayers and spite, got my crew home. They gave me a medal. Then they grounded me for 6 months while they investigated whether I'd violated protocols by not abandoning the aircraft. Tom said nothing. There was nothing to say to that kind of institutional betrayal. "When I came back, things were different. I was different. But I kept flying because it's what I know. It's who I am. And eventually, some people noticed that a pilot willing to fly broken helicopters through hostile airspace might be useful for operations that don't officially exist." She turned to look at him then, really look at him. And Tom saw something in her expression he recognized from mirrors on bad days. The question of whether staying matters more than leaving. "Your runway saved my life tonight," Kestrel said. "Not metaphorically, literally. We had an emergency, needed a secure location outside normal channels, and this place appeared on the map like Providence." She gestured at the darkness, the fields, the simple fact of Earth meeting sky in a way that allowed flight. "So I'm telling you this because you deserve to know that what you built here, what you kept alive even when it made no financial sense, it matters. It saved people. Tonight, and maybe other nights you'll never know about." Something tight in Tom's chest loosened slightly. He didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand the larger machinery at work. But he understood that his stubborn insistence on maintaining a runway nobody used had somehow become a point of intersection between his small world and whatever vast operations Kestrel moved through. "The foreclosure," he said, "that's real, that'll actually go away." "It's already gone," Kestrel replied. "As of about 30 minutes ago. The bank system just hasn't updated yet. You'll get a letter in a week apologizing for the error." Tom felt dizzy. How? People who don't exist can make changes that don't officially happen. She finished the coffee, handed back the mug. "Get some rest, Tom. We'll be gone before sunrise. You'll never see us again. But your land is yours now, clean and clear, for as long as you want to keep those lights burning." She walked away before he could respond, back toward the command post in the barn where screens glowed and equipment hummed, and things were happening that he had no clearance to understand. Tom stood in the rain for a long time after, looking at his runway, at the invisible aircraft he knew were positioned in the darkness, at the ordinary miracle of a place where flight could happen. He went inside around 4. Lay down on the couch but didn't sleep. Listened to rain and voices, and the occasional burst of rotor noise as aircraft moved in and out with the precision of surgical strikes. He thought about his grandfather and his father, and all the generations of practical men who'd worked this land without ever imagining it might become a fulcrum point for invisible wars. The rain stopped at dawn. Tom dozed for maybe 20 minutes, then jerked awake to silence. Complete silence. He walked outside into morning light that turned the wet fields gold and found nothing. No Black Hawk, no little bird, no equipment, no personnel, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Just his barn, his runway, and the smell of clean air after storm. For a moment he wondered if he'd hallucinated the entire thing, some stress-induced break from reality. But there, on the fuel tank near the runway, sat a folded piece of paper weighted down with a stone. Tom picked it up, unfolded it with shaking hands. Kestrel was written at the top in neat handwriting. Below that just 3 words, "Thank you, farmer." Below that a phone number, And below that, if you ever need anything, call once, it'll be answered. Tom folded the paper carefully, put it in his pocket, and walked back to his house. A week later, the bank sent an apologetic letter about clerical errors and canceled debts. The local newspaper ran a small story about mysterious accounting mistakes benefiting rural landowners. Tom gave a brief interview where he said he guessed he'd just gotten lucky, and people believed him because what else could explain it? But sometimes, late at night when insomnia kept him awake, Tom would stand at his window and look at the runway lights burning in the darkness. And he'd think about pilots who flew missions that didn't exist, about land that mattered for reasons invisible to the people who owned it, about the strange intersection of ordinary lives and extraordinary circumstances. The paper stayed in his pocket for 6 months before he transferred it to a lockbox in his bedroom. He never called the number, never needed to, but knowing it existed, knowing somewhere out there was a pilot who'd landed in his storm and called him by his simple title, farmer, like it was the most honorable designation she could imagine, that knowledge changed something fundamental. He kept the runway maintained, kept the lights operational, and every time the bank sent statements showing zero balance, Tom would touch the lockbox and whisper thank you to the empty room, to the pilot who'd vanished into dawn, to whatever invisible machinery protected people who didn't know they needed protecting. Years later, after Tom died peacefully in his sleep at 83, his nephew found the paper while clearing out the house, found the phone number and, curiosity overwhelming caution, called it. The voice that answered was younger than expected, female, with an accent that suggested East Coast education and military precision. "This is Kestrel's line. State your purpose." The nephew explained about Tom, about finding the number, about wanting to know if the stories his uncle sometimes hinted at were real. There was a long pause. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time. "Your uncle was a good man. He provided a safe harbor when we needed it most. Tell me, is the runway still operational?" I don't know. I haven't checked." "Check," the voice said. "Keep it operational. The world is complicated, and places where good people maintain safe ground are rarer than you think. If you do this, if you continue what your uncle started, there may come a night when aircraft land in darkness and you'll have to make the same choice he did." "What choice?" "Whether to trust that some things matter more than understanding them." The line went dead. The nephew stood in his uncle's house, holding a piece of paper with a phone number and a call sign, and felt the weight of inheritance settling onto his shoulders. He walked out to the runway that afternoon, saw weeds growing through cracks, saw lights that hadn't been tested in months. He spent the next week making repairs. Didn't tell his wife why. Couldn't have explained it if he tried. But 3 years later, on a night when thunderstorms rolled across Missouri and rain hammered the earth with biblical intensity, a Black Hawk appeared in the darkness. Different aircraft, different crew, but the same essential transaction. Desperate need meeting prepared ground. The pilot who emerged was young, maybe 30, with captain's bars and a name tape that read Bishop. "You Tom Hendricks?" he asked. "Nephew," the nephew replied. "Tom died 3 years back." Bishop nodded slowly, taking in the maintained runway, the operational lights, the evidence of continuation. He was a legend. Did you know that? In certain circles, the story of the farmer who kept the lights burning became something we told new pilots, a reminder that civilians can be force multipliers if they're willing to hold the line in small ways. "I didn't know." "Most legends don't." Bishop turned back toward the Black Hawk, made a hand signal. "We need 12 hours, same arrangement. When we leave, you get compensation. Not cash, we don't work that way. But problems you didn't know you had will quietly resolve. Consider it investment in keeping this place operational." The nephew thought about his uncle, about mysterious debt cancellations, and the strange pride in Tom's voice when he talked about the runway. Thought about the voice on the phone saying some things matter more than understanding them. "Yeah," he said, "okay." And so the cycle continued. The runway stayed operational. The lights kept burning. And on certain nights, when weather provided cover and circumstances required it, aircraft that didn't officially exist would touch down on a Missouri soybean farm where generations of practical men had somehow built something that mattered in ways that transcended property value or agricultural yield. Kestrel herself returned once, 15 years after that first storm. She was older now, hair gone completely silver, but still carrying herself with the same quiet authority. She landed a different bird, a Chinook, big and heavy, and spent 6 hours using the barn as a coordination center for something that involved a lot of encrypted communication and tense waiting. When she left, she found the nephew and shook his hand exactly the way she'd shaken Tom's. "Your uncle would be proud," she said. "This place has saved more lives than you'll ever know, more missions than I can count. You're part of something bigger, whether you wanted to be or not." "What am I part of?" Kestrel smiled, thin and sharp, the same expression Tom had described in the stories he'd sometimes told. "A network of good people maintaining safe ground. That's all. That's everything." She walked away, climbed back into the Chinook, and lifted into twilight. The nephew watched until the aircraft was just a dark speck against darker sky, then walked back to his house where his wife asked him questions he couldn't answer and eventually stopped asking, because some silences are their own kind of answer. The airstrip remained. The lights kept burning, and somewhere in filing cabinets that officially didn't exist, in databases accessible only to people with clearances beyond normal classification, Tom Hendrick's soybean farm was marked with a quiet designation: Safe Harbor. Nobody knew all the places that carried this designation. Nobody knew all the farmers and ranchers and small-town Americans who'd been approached in darkness, asked impossible questions, and said yes, because sometimes the right thing is obvious even when the reasons aren't. But they existed, these places, scattered across the country like points in a constellation visible only to those who knew to look. And pilots like Kestrel, flying missions between the margins of official recognition, moved between these points with the confidence of people who understood that infrastructure isn't just highways and airports and military bases. Sometimes it's a stubborn farmer who keeps runway lights burning in a storm. Sometimes it's the choice to trust that the world is protected by more than what gets reported on the evening news. Years accumulated. The nephew got older. His own children grew up playing near the runway, not knowing that their ordinary childhood was lived on ground that had strategic significance, not knowing that the occasional nighttime landings their father facilitated were part of operations that would never be declassified, never be acknowledged, never appear in any official accounting of how the nation's security was maintained. But the pilots knew, the crews knew, and in ready rooms and briefing spaces scattered across military installations whose existence was classified, young aviators heard the story of the farmer who kept the lights burning, heard about Kestrel, the legend who'd flown broken birds through impossible conditions and later built networks of civilian support that operated outside formal channels, heard about the intersection of ordinary courage and extraordinary circumstances. And on dark nights when missions went wrong, when extraction sites got compromised and formal options evaporated, these young pilots would pull up maps showing tiny airstrips on private land scattered across flyover country, would see designations like Safe Harbor, and understand that someone somewhere had made a choice to be part of the invisible architecture that kept desperate people alive.